Hello, good evening for everyone here. We are going to discuss something that I'm not sure how much time you actually spend thinking about what is the cultural canon of Latvia? And maybe even less you're thinking, why Swedish people don't have cultural canon yet? But we're going to figure it out. I hope you'll have lots of questions. And we have a great panel today for you here in Cesis. First of all, we have a guest from Sweden, Lars Trädgård, who is in charge in Sweden discussing and deciding what's going to be in Swedish cultural canon. Latvians, for change, we already done it. So, exactly. It happens that Netherlands have a cultural canon from 2006, and Denmark and Norway, and also Latvians. So we're going to see why and what does it mean actually and how they differ and about different discussions here. So our panel today is, first of all, those who read actually some posters and information, you are like, where's Dāvis Sīmanis, the famous Latvian film director and head of the Latvian Academy of Culture. He's stuck somewhere in Jugla and couldn't make it because of the car troubles. So, but sometimes you can get someone even better. Dagnija Baltiņa. Those who are here from Latvia, for sure know that she's the new appointed director of National Library of Latvia. And she was also former Secretary General of the Latvian National Commission for UNESCO, and actually also involved in developing a site and about the Latvian cultural canon in Latvia. So it's good to have an insider here. Lars Trädgård is a writer, historian, and you can mention all your other amazing things you've done in Sweden that we are not aware of. Olga Procevska is now living in Tartu. Estonians don't have cultural canon, at least something that they don't have and we have. Olga Procevska has written vastly about the minorities in Latvia, about Latgale. She's an expert of communication. And I hope you also have some, the distance makes heart grow fonder. Hopefully you can look at the Latvian cultural canon also as a different kind of perspective. Krista Burana, here from Cesis. She's a theater director, a film director, is doing community theater, ecology, nature theater, and all kinds of activities. So, and since Latvian cultural canon now also has landscapes and nature's a part of it, so I think that we have some things to discuss. So, but I think it would be fair just to give floor first to our guest, Lars. So what happened? How that happened that your neighbors have cultural canon? Why Swedes refused to do that, or discussed at least? And what are the discussion now in the Swedish society creating it? Who is in? Who is out?
Well, this is a good question. First of all, let me point out that we used to have a cultural canon. We didn't quite call it that, but if you go back to Sweden, let's say the second half of the 19th century until the 1950s, we actually had a pretty explicit cultural canon represented both in schools, right? We had special books in civics as well as Swedish history and culture, which contained a lot of primary sources, right? Classical works. And this was an important project both from the point of view of the state, but also in our popular movements. We have this tradition of popular education going back to the folk high schools, common throughout the Nordic countries. So what happens really is that after the Second World War, Sweden sort of takes a turn when it comes to its own national identity. And we start to identify primarily with modernity, right? That Sweden, the most modern country, with also internationalism, right, which became very, very important. And then in later decades, multiculturalism. and diversity, sort of as kind of defining qualities. And the Swedes are very proud of all of those three. There's a lot of good things to say about that. I mean, there's a great advantage to say yes to modernity and the future, to think about internationalism or diversity. But what happened, which was not it was not an intended consequence, but what happened was that there was less interest in Swedish history and culture, kind of a lack of investment, in fact, right, in the common we, in citizenship. And what has happened now, partly thanks to those developments and changes in the school curriculum, which is today almost has no common core curriculum about Swedish culture and history, combined then with the challenges associated with immigration, particularly integration. So how do we have two balls in the air, both saying yes, right, to diversity and, constructing a common we? I think you might recognize some of these challenges here in Latvia as well. So it's not a question of that you choose one over the other, but it's about trying to understand that we probably need to have both to have a sustainable social contract and a society that holds together. The Swedish word for society is samhälle, literally means holding something together. And that is actually today a real question in Sweden, where we have some pretty serious challenges right now that I think has to do with something we're going to talk about tomorrow, namely trust, sense of community and belonging. And, so these are serious questions, and I think that, is the backdrop to this initiative that has come a little bit unexpectedly. But I think that's at least how I would try to explain it.
Do you think that it's concerned, Swedes are concerned that the cultural canon is something too connected to identity, but also too nationalistic, or it's too inclusive, or too exclusive, actually? So what is the trouble with that? What is the concern?
I think you're pointing to the very issues. I think that because Swedes, to such a great extent, have come to see themselves as the ultimate internationalist country. I mean, this is a paradox here, that our national identity is organized around the international, or the anti-national, or the post-national, right? So that in itself is kind of funny, right, to kind of recognize. But I think you're absolutely right. So that nationalism has become a dirty word, essentially, right? And I, as an historian, of course, like to point out the fact that if you do not have a sense of national community, you have no basis for either democracy or a welfare state, which has to be based on some notion of solidarity, and without a sense of a commonality, how are you going to create that? So ultimately, I think it's like this. Swedes take for granted things that I don't think you take for granted here. We take for granted many things: clean water, social trust, a kind of a stable state. We are one of the oldest stable states in Europe. So Swedes don't usually think that, oh my God, we have to do something to create a sense of national community or state, because we take it for granted, right, until now. So it's easy to sort of take an anti-national perspective, then you can take for granted something that in many other parts of the world you cannot take for granted. So there is a certain type of naivete or blindness here operating in the background. But you're absolutely right. Now we have a situation where many people, particularly people, let's say, on the left politically, right, who view this project potentially as kind of a quasi-authoritarian attempt at imposing kind of homogeneity, not respecting, minorities and immigrants and so forth. So that is part of the discussion, right, that you have. So I think you in your question, you already put your finger on some of the most sort of central aspects that are debated right now.
About talking about minorities, I tried to follow a discussion that's been in Latvia since 2008, 9, then in other waves 2013, about what does it mean, this cultural canon, for people, also for people that are from minorities. Journalist Olga Proskurova wrote that she doesn't see herself in a cultural canon. She thought there's not enough, in Latvian case, not enough women, not enough culture that is presented from minorities. I checked, actually, there's not all the believers, there's like, you see, of course, Catholics, you see some Polish maybe traditions, but obviously it seems that Latvia has made a cultural canon is something that we are very proud of, that can help maybe integrate people to show how beautiful and what are the values of Latvia. But maybe it's not been very inclusive, and maybe there's a reason for that. So in 2009, there was high school students were asked, hello, do you know anything about cultural canon? So what are the important things in Latvian canon? So what they said is, of course, Song and Dance Festival, Dziesmu Svētki, comes first. Tautas dziesmas, like national, like folk songs. Main summer night celebrations, you know, Jāņa, Mārtiņdiena, Martin Day, maybe because it's celebrated in schools, Christmas, Freedom Monument, and language. And when you ask them, like someone, meaning ask them, there's no mention of anything that to do with visual art, cinema, theater, all these things that are in Latvian canon. And also when they were asked, why we need cultural canon, it was said, in order for us not to forget Latvian cultural values, 33% thought about that, and 21% we have to know how we are different than others, meaning how this cultural canon is different than all the other canons. And 19% said it's for foreigners, just foreigners, you know, they have to learn about us. So I will ask Dagny Baltic, who was involved creating, you know, or discussing on the cultural canon. So what's your take on that? What was the discussion? Why it happened that, I don't know, minorities and women are not that, you know, either relevant or highlighted in our Latvian cultural canon?
Thank you very much. I think going back to this debate, I would very much advocate on the idea of listing and categorization as such, because I think it's also always a very great way of seeing what we do not have listed. So it's also a reverse psychology. Once listing something, we also start noticing what is not on that list, and hence we get a ground for a good discussion. And I think this is also the case for a cultural canon. It's always we can always criticize what has not been included there. But I think it is very hard to make this first step, and actually then it's a very good problem to actually have a discussion on what we can add there in, and not the first step only to go and stop always. No, we have to just start everything over and over again. And coming from this heritage background where everything is about categorization and pointing out things which and why they're valuable for a certain society, I think we really, really sensitize our skill in seeing the values all around us, naming them. And sometimes it just starts from, I don't know, a rooftop, and then you start analyzing why that rooftop matters, and then you start finding the arguments. And I think this is also part of the process that we can follow up now, since 2008, 2009, about the cultural canon, that we currently have grown up the skill to openly discuss what we don't like about it, what we miss there, and what we can upgrade it with. And I think it was a very different process now, how the landscapes were added in 2021, because it started with an initiative in 2018 asking the whole population what are their, in a way, landscape, I would say iconic landscapes they associate themselves with. And then it grew out, and there were these chosen landscapes were given to experts to describe them. While in 2008, the debate was very different. The Ministry of Culture established a group of experts of various, I would say, fields of culture. And I would say, still from the perspective what we can criticize, they did, I would say, they were quite up to date because they talked about architecture and design. They do talk about intangible heritage, which are new concepts at that time. And still they are thinking, I would say, a little bit out of the box already then. But of course, the approach by then is to really, really ask the experts which are the most valuable items. And of course, they have to distill down to 99. And that's also a big thing. And I think the problem there is always about listing is this, I don't know, this fascination with numerology. And I think this was one of the aspects where the landscape aspect was always discussed, whether we should add, whether we should stop by 99 because it's such a great number. And I think this has been always also at UNESCO, many conversations have stopped just because of the argument, if we grow beyond 1,000, then it's just going to be an endless Pandora's box of everything added. But again, I think once we were able to overstep and found a good argument that if we add landscapes based upon the argument that actually the society in a way contributed to extending the limits of cultural canon, I think then we can grow with the canon. So I think now the next question is when we'll be brave enough next time, and based on which grounds and based on which arguments, and how we are going to be able to discuss it. And I think that's the next question.
The thing you mentioned, that people send in more than 50 photos of what they think is essential Latvian landscape. So I think that sounds amazing. But then it's like, let's cut it all in four parts, yeah? Like Zemgale and Kurzeme, like, meaning each landscape should be represented. And it's also something as vast as seacoast landscape that is pretty long and includes everything, you know. Do we have rocks on a beach or we don't have them? And landscape of Zemgale lowlands. And then there's Latvian forests. Something is... I understood this idea that is created because it's interaction or influence of the human like Latvians who live here, you know, on the nature. On the other side, I think it's also very deliberate, like let's spread all those landscapes all over Latvia. So nobody's offended, like Latgale has their lakes and, you know, like each region has something. But do you know anything about these discussions? The Academy of Culture is actually involved. You know, they talk to students, they talk to high school students. What should be added in this cultural canon? Because at this point, when you look at the theater and cinema, there's no Signe Bauman and Rocks in My Pockets or something like that. Everything is very old there.
I agree, but again, I have to say we have to a little bit grow the basic mass of knowledge in order to start analyzing what we're missing out there. And I think over the last year, the Academy of Culture, together with the National Library of Latvia, we have been working on these cultural canon competitions with students, actually sensitizing them to think of whether they would safeguard, say, certain cultural canon aspects or items or objects included, whether they would contest them and delete them. But again, it's also the question, would you delete anything, which again sensitizes a different, not whether you would add anything, but whether you would also delete something as, I don't know, politically now not correct or something wrong, or simply you don't feel you belong to it anymore. So yes, I think the question comes up, what should be added? There are many ideas, and I think the cultural canon is always open for these ideas, what could be added, like either from literature, either from cinema or film, either from also contemporary poetry, for whatever. But I think this discussion is that we have to grow up, I would say, a certain maturity of the whole population to be able to name and ground, not only to call something, because it's very popular to say, oh, it's a I don't know, for example, Jelgava Palace. Somebody put out that Jelgava Palace should be. It's easy to call out some kind of an object, and then the problem comes when you need to start arguing what is so valuable about it. And I think this is something, it's also the same for UNESCO listing when we discuss. It's easy to say, I want this object listed. But when you start sensitizing and you try to establish this outstanding universal value, which is similar for the cultural canon, so when you have to put out this paragraph of a really, with this pitch of information, what is so valuable, then people start, oh, it's actually, when they start to name, it's not that easy anymore, and you actually can't do that easily. So for Jelgava Palace, I think it's very hard to describe this. It's, of course, valuable, but when you have to actually make this next step, just not to name it, but to explain it, and to give actually a value statement, then it becomes another level of problem.
The Latvian national canon doesn't come with money, just so to be clear. So it means that we can put Salaspils Memorial, you know, what's the memorial, big one, on a campsite, and at the same time not to have money at all to repair even, you know, where you walk on these basic tiles, you know. That's also one of the things that you, from one side, you're like, oh, we do appreciate it. Another side, who's going to pay for that, to preserving it? Probably some Minister of Culture, you know, or something. But Olga and Krista, so I want to involve you in this conversation. When you look at the culture canon, what was something, I don't know, highlights or criticisms when you read it, or what you found there, what you didn't find relevant to your life?
Actually, I looked to this canon yesterday, starting to think what to say in this conversation. Maybe I looked to it when it was created, but actually I spent those mostly 15 years now without it, happily. But I understand the reason, or I assume that I see the reason why this canon was made. In 2007 it was started. Somehow it was, I think, connected with our process of joining European Union, and somehow we really needed to find the base for ourselves and foreigners to say we have this past with those cultural events, people, values, which connect us with this cultural field and this cultural history and tradition and ways of thinking about the world. And at that point, we, as you said, we put our first steps on our understanding of ourselves in the past. And now what is missing is what you're saying, is that there is no people, ideas, values, which leads us to the future. And from the other side, it's okay, because it's canon. Canon cannot be avant-garde, so it cannot be something which is about our next steps. But in the same time, for the school, for high school students, for the universities, it's important material for the learning, and then changing attitudes, changing values, changing the things which we would like to be included in the, let's say, in the next 20 years. We would like to see more women. There are only 8, and no one now. If we speak about the films or theater, there's now works included made by women directors. So
Mara Timmel is there.
Yeah, but she's like a director. But when we look to the performances or the films, all of them are made by men. So we would like to speak about the other minorities, but in the same time, I think it is national cultural canon, and I think it is important that we speak about the culture which is made on the base of Latvian language. And I think it is for Latvia. For Sweden, maybe it's different. It is this common base which we need to promote as a base where we create art and art events as language where we promote common values too. So, yeah, this is short things.
Let's use the fact that Olga actually at least was born in Kraslava and comes from the region. So when you say it should involve Latvian language, one is like leaves here who are sitting, of course, many leaves are like Latvian language. And another, leave languages culture is actually in a Latvian cultural canon. And also Latgalian. From Latgale comes these May prayer singings and cemetery culture and these prayers in Latgalian. Yeah, so it's mentioned there. Olga, so what's your reflection about that?
Well, first of all, I find it's funny that it's called canon, because it sounds like it's going to fire at you. And I think in general, it's a legitimate exercise in self-understanding and self-reflection, which shouldn't be taken too seriously. Or it should be at least understood as something that has opportunities but also limitations. And that something that have to have boundaries, because otherwise it's meaningless, but it has to be reasonably closed but also reasonably open. But I don't think that we have found that balance, maybe, but I think it's okay to find it now. For example, maybe it was a first phase when we thought about it as something fixed, something coming from the past, and now we like can have cultural canon 2.0 when we can maybe take it more openly, maybe approach it more from the bottom than from the top. But then are we prepared for surprises as well? That maybe if we ask people what do they find valuable, maybe actually we will discover that they don't mention women. or maybe we discover that they don't care about theater performances that were very key and crucial in 1970s. Or maybe they, for them, Jāņi is very important, but they do shashlik. So it's dangerous, you know. So, but I think that to continue the process, you need some transformation of the approach. But I'm not the one who would argue for some mechanical inclusion of minorities or inclusion of women or inclusion of different generations. I think that it's a good result, but if it's enforced top-down, it really contradicts the purpose, actually. So.
But do you see your generation to be presented there in cultural canon?
No, but I kind of do not expect to, because, and also, as you have said, hearts do grow fonder in distance. And as I moved away from Latvia 3 years ago, I really have grown sentimental for some of the things that are considered culture and canon, but also being exposed through learning Estonian language to Estonian culture, I also am seeing now a little bit different approach to the cultural canon that, for example, yes, Estonians do not have it as fixed in such a fixed form as we do, but Estonians tell you about it all the time. They're very good in marketing. So, and they include in that the black smoke sauna and robotic parcel delivery machines that go around Tallinn. And it goes together in a very, very nice way. And I really enjoy this approach to the culture where you can see that we are rooted in a heritage that's unique, or at least perceived unique. I know that sauna discussions are heated, pun intended, that like Latvians would say that no, it's ours, and Finnish would just kick everyone out of the room. But anyway, I think it's a good thing to say that this is ours, and this is what we defined as a community that lives here find valuable. But also you have to be reasonably open that it will change with time, that a new generation that will come maybe will say that they found different things valuable.
So, and the question for all of you, so Sweden and Latvian included, so we can always, I guess, because of the history of our, at least Latvian political, ethics, we should be, I think, a bit aware of how to mitigate influence of politicizing this cultural canon. You know, that we only think these Ministry of Culture has been under National Unity Party, where now it's in different hands of progressives. You know, I'm thinking how this political influence might, have a say in creating these new additions to the Latvian cultural canon. Maybe not, but is it a concern in Sweden? You also have democracy, you know, government's changing.
Well, you know, remember, I'm an historian, so I'm not so impressed with the idea that things change all the time. You know, as historians, we see sticky structures, right? And we're interested in that, right? You know, what formed, you know, Sweden. And we're talking about things like rule of law, right? Right now in Norway, about a month ago, they celebrated the 750-year anniversary of the first national law. You know, that stuff is important, and it will stay important for a long time. And I think that for me as an historian, my culture concept is broader, right? You know, I'm not against, let's say, looking at literature or music or art. You know, that often is a way to express things that are values that have a long, long history and remain important today. But, you know, it is equally true, right, that our tradition when it comes to our political culture, our economic culture, the construction of rule of law, right? These things are every bit as important. And I think that one way to think about this is to think about the individual's relationship, on the one hand, to the state, on the other hand, in civil society, right? And I think that if you think about, you know, the state, you know, what unites us is actually things like our common laws, right? We don't have a choice there, right? And we have to try to understand what is underlying that in terms of values. I mean, in Sweden today, we have had for a long time very strong emphasis on both gender equality and on individual freedom and choice, right? And they don't just come out of nowhere. These are just inventions of some trigger-happy social engineers operating in the 1970s, right? They have a much, much longer history, and it's important to understand that if we want to kind of grasp why we have these laws, right? And we also have a very old state structure, right, that goes back to, let's say, the 16th, 17th century. And if we don't understand that properly, right, we don't have a very good way that we can transmit that knowledge to young people or to people who arrive and immigrants coming into the country. And I think to connect that with, let's say, what happens in civil society is also to understand the balance between what is common, right? I mean, you can't choose between laws, right? You have to recognize that these are actually given. But when it comes to what is expressed in civil society in the form of, let's say, literature, art, or for that matter, food, right? You know, the kind of ordinary daily expressions of culture. There, I think, an embrace of fluidity and diversity is in some ways unproblematic and extremely important, right? But again, you have to have two balls in the air, right? You can't just reduce the discussion to, you know, diversity versus homogeneity. You have to understand that, you know, it plays out differently in these different relationships that we have. But the questions are, you know, of course, going to be heated. We have the same discussion in Sweden now. Let's say, what are we going to include? Or, you know, so are we going to draw a line, right? Are we going to sort of delimit?
But do you have like, is it cinnamon buns, Ingmar Bergman?
Well, in my point of view as an historian is, I ask the question is, what is it that has formed Sweden? So, you know, I'm not against cinnamon buns, you know, fine. I ate one actually earlier today. But, you know, I wouldn't, you know, say that, you know, this is something that, you know, we first and foremost have to think about. We're trying to make kind of a distinction between everyday culture, right, the quotidian culture, which I think is very important to people. And what is sort of, what at a somewhat deeper level, right, has formed. Both of them are important. They're both part of culture, right? But they are qualitatively different. So those are sort of choices we make. The other choice is time, right? Are we going to include everything that's happened until yesterday? Right? Some people argue that if you're going to determine whether something really is important over a long period of time, you probably have to say, you know, let's not even discuss things that were created in our lifetime, right? But in the Swedish case, then that becomes a challenge because so much has happened, right, in the last 30 years. So this is another one of these issues. It's not an easy answer to it because there are good arguments on both sides, right? Most people would say that, for example, if you want to canonize literature, all right, chances are that most things that have been written in the last 20 years are going to be forgotten in 30 years from now, right? So, you know, right, even the Nobel Prize Committee giving prize in literature have a little problem here, right? Because things aren't necessarily lasting quite that way. But
writers keep dying.
Yeah,
or you can get to them.
That's right. You know, there is that argument. That actually was in principle in the Danish, canon, that if people were still alive, their works wouldn't qualify, right? But the argument against it in Sweden is very powerful because today we have 25% or so of the population foreign-born. They are a huge part actually, right, of Swedish society today. So what is happening right now? Somehow, from my point of view, that's a legitimate question, right, to ask. To what extent are we taking that into account? And of course, we have a much longer history too. It's true that things change. It's also true that things stay the same, right? So finding the balance between those two when you're thinking about, what should constitute a canon. The big question for me is asking why should we care, and what is the purpose of this? It's not about making a best-of lists, here are the 10 best literary works. It is what matters. So that is my guiding light in this.
Okay, that's why you're not too disturbed by this.
I just wanted to follow up. Like, I'm also a historian, so I very much feel and sensitize it very much. But just to build on that, and also what Olga said, I think it's also the story of us and how we tell. And I think that approach for updating a cultural canon, the very important is not to do it mechanically, by just saying we need more female or we need more diversity and inclusivity. It is the story of us, and it would be about personalities, it would be about certain legal documents as well, because they, I think, are also very important. And I've really much, because I remember we were also celebrating the 350th anniversary of the first Cultural Heritage Act, Protection Act from Sweden. So I do see the point how it actually has had an influence on it. So for Latvian case, I would say we should question whether it's Mitjels Valters, whether it's Latvian constitution, and how to include the Baltic Way, for example, as a movement. And they would not really fall into any of these categories. Neither they would be exclusively female, they would be inclusively about certain minority groups, they would be about either thinkers, either movements, either concepts. And I think that would be the one that would create this story of us. Why we need this story of us. I remember in early 2000s when all the European Union doors were open just before we joined, there were all these European youth exchanges. And it was fascinating. They always made us play these games. What do you know about this country? What stereotypes do you have? And I don't know if you remember this, that, for example, Portugal would never had a clue anything about Latvia. Yeah. And it was always this embarrassing moment when everybody's like, no, we have nothing to tell about you. Because we did not have this story of us. And I think the cultural canon is actually, a speaking point list for anyone to tell about what is our story. And then you just pick your points, what you want to talk about, whether it's more about art because you know about, whether it's cinema because you yourself have watched films, whether it's about literature because you have read any, whether it's about any landscape because you like hiking. And this is how you find the links with other cultures. So it's not that you have to master and play it like with every card on the list, but it's really that you have to master these things. And I think this is also fascinating that we are at the National Library of Latvia are doing through the educational programs. In a way, you shuffle the cards and you teach school pupils that you have actually these cards in your hands. In a way, you serve this baggage that now you can walk in the shoes whenever you go. You have at least some cards to tell the story of us. And I think this is exactly what is the cultural canon about. And that's why you build it on, because you develop who we are, what are our milestones, what are our strongholds, what is our base. And also, when you say also, I don't believe in these values, it's also a story of us. For example, I don't associate myself anymore with these kind of, practices of certain Christian groups. That's also a story of us, what I have given up. And I think this is something that also takes much more courage to start talking about this. Who am I?
Just a little footnote, because I think one of the beauties with the Dutch canon, right, is that it has this sort of openness to renewal and change. And also, I think it ties in a little bit to the whole concept here of being from different countries, is that you have different cultural circles, right? So, you have one that's very local, you have one that is national. In our case, there's a Nordic, Baltic dimension to it. There's, of course, a European one as well. There's a fluidity in that, that also needs to be taken into account if you want to kind of get the full richness, right, of what we're talking about.
Yeah. Olga?
When Lars and Dagny were talking, I remembered a recent episode when Sklandrausis was placed on a worst food list, some obscure, but whatever. And then nation was divided. Though half of people said, no, Sklandraus is the best. And the others said, yeah, I always thought it's crap. So, and it's actually a discussion of the cultural canon in its purest form. And this is a thing where a process is at least as important as the result. And what you have been describing is actually a beautiful process of national self-reflection, which I think is the main point. And this is the main reason to keep it open and revisit it, because what we exchange in process is the most important thing, not if we do put this or that on the list, because the list is just a means to think about it and to talk about it.
But just imagine the expert fights for cinema to do this top of the top, creme de la creme. And then it's like, and all these stretch movies didn't make it, as if they just stop existing in our Latvian canon. So I thought that these discussions would be actually the most interesting part of the creating the canon. Krista, so are you concerned about this political influence? Are you concerned about that forests are actually our cultural canon, that we are actually just destroying while we are, of course, writing poetry and taking photos of them?
There are such many questions in your questions. So about political influence, we can't somehow to avoid it. Of course, it will be, because it is connected with this notion to tell particular story, and then of course there will win someone who are in the leading positions and who has loudest voice and etc. And
I was just thinking, we can't avoid it, but we can maybe mitigate it somehow. That we are
okay. Again, who is we and
people who work in culture? It's cultural canon. We are people who are actually actively working in Latvian culture, Swedish. So, is there a way how we can mitigate it?
I think yes, because actually already existing canon includes every national good things which people stands for, and we don't need to exclude them. So now we can to add or to speak about what we would like to, or what kind of story we would like to add to already existing one. So and it is somehow connected with your question about the landscapes, because what I see in this landscape list is not existing ones, but our thoughts about what we have, but somehow in a past feelings. Again, it's not about existing ones. It's like a romanticized perception of Latvian culture, and which is based of our perception of the nature. So it's more about what we liked and what we would like, but it's not about today. So if we could use this canon to say, okay, what we can do to preserve what we have at this moment, that it would be a useful thing. If we just look to these landscapes and think, oh yes, it was a nice one, how sad that we lose that, then yeah, it's again just a thing for the museums.
It used to be so nice, but now we have these lovely pig farms, you know, built into our landscape. That becomes a part of the landscape.
And actually, I was in Denmark in the end of the May, and they have quite a big discussion about Danish national identity as a farmers, which is come together with the Latvian identity as a farmer nation. But in the same time, they see how this national identity destroy their lands and their nature, and how they now have to fight with polluted, not only the lands, but the sea, and it comes from the national identity. So maybe we have to ask ourselves what is in our national identity which harms the way of our living, our society, our lands, and start to think about changing now our perception of the national identity. So, calambur.
Few short notes, because we hope that maybe people who are here have questions to ask to the panel. Yes, go.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I find this really interesting, your comments here. And if I turn it to Sweden, right, you know, our primary identity has not been that of being peasants, right, but of being engineers, right, and that ties into the whole thing about, you know, sort of modernity, right, and so we do the sort of the same thing, but using engineering, right, you know, so we have given a primacy, right, to sort of seeing nature in terms of raw materials, right, that we use to make, you know, Volvos and, you know, whatever it is, right, and it's a huge part of, you know, who we are, and we see nature primarily as a resource for that sort of production. Now, thankfully, it's a big country in terms of geography, and with not so many people, so we still retain some. But you look at forestry, right? I mean, forestry and our paper industry is huge. Same thing as with minerals, right? You know, and mining. And both forestry and mining are extraordinarily destructive, right? If you care about sustainable nature. So I think we have a similar problem, but with using a slightly different logic in terms of the national identity.
And maybe you don't know, but a lot of Latvian forest belongs to Swedes. So, and somehow we are destroying our lands together.
Okay, so I have a question for the public. Do you have any questions? Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm the ambassador of Sweden. This is so interesting. And I know we're running short, so I'll be short. Olga, you alluded to national branding when you spoke about Canon. And that was actually my question. How would you use it in national branding? And also, can character traits be part of cultural canon? Alluding a little bit to what you just said about our identity, because I was thinking you could actually politicize a canon by incorporating characters or national traits in order to also to promote it in your national branding. If I make myself clear. Okay, thank you.
Thanks for such a great question. I actually have an answer for both of your questions. There was an attempt, a very successful attempt, and I saw one of the authors in the public for some time, to include a trait of character, which is introvertism, and to make it a brand. So there was a campaign, I am introvert, that was designed to promote Latvian literature abroad. And I think we can all agree that it was very, and still is, a very successful campaign. So yes and yes. And I think that the key part of using national canon, national cultural canon as in branding is that people actually believe that thing, and they actually are truly on an everyday level connected to that. For example, like in Estonia, while learning the language, we were told that Estonians invented a sport, and that's called kicking. That's actually just crazy swinging, where you go around with a swing. And it felt real because I saw people doing that in the park. So if you actually do the thing that's written in your canon, then you can sell it very nicely.
Okay, any other questions? I can pass you the mic.
Yes, hi, I'm Kai from Finland, and this discussion made me think about the kind of question of of the diversity of the national canon, because in Finland, quite a big part of our national canon is actually in Swedish, and created by Finns who spoke Swedish, and so, for example, our national anthem has been originally written in Swedish. And I think that the interesting thing to think about also is that that the national canon always comes from somewhere, and it's usually also many parts of it are connected to other cultures, other like minorities, and maybe this is kind of a question for the historians there also. Like, would it be also beneficial somehow to highlight that maybe big parts of the canon actually also are not so national in a way, that they have a background and history that also connects those things to other parts of the world and are done by other people. And I think that kind of also goes with landscapes, because we tend to value some similar landscapes that are somehow been relevant somewhere else also. So in a way, see the national canon also from a more kind of a diverse point of view.
Yeah, I sort of talked a little bit about that earlier, right, when I proposed this sort of classical anthropological idea of sort of kulturkretser, circles of culture that include much more than just either the local or the national or even the regional, right? And I mean, clearly you can't really understand, let's say, Swedish political culture without also taking into account the influence of the French Enlightenment, right? Or for that matter, the Scottish Enlightenment, right? So clearly you are right about that, and I think this is why I was bringing this up before. But it's also true that you have to understand the difference between regions, right? Inside of a country that has strong local traditions. Right? That's why I like also again the Dutch canon, because it has also this idea of windows that are also localized as well as being, supranational, right? And I think that level of sophistication is needed in a canon project for it not to become a dead project, from the very beginning, so to speak. So I can only say that I totally agree with everything you said, and for me it's very important to have that kind of broader view, right, of what it means. Doesn't mean that there isn't also the sort of national. I mean, Finland and Sweden were one country for a very, very long time, and even though we speak very different languages, a linguist I know told me that there's still no two languages that are easier to translate into each other, because conceptually, right, we are so similar, right, from a cultural standpoint. And so there is a kind of a stability there, and when I look at Finland, I see so many things that are recognized right away, and it's not so strange because we've been together for a really long time, which doesn't mean that there aren't differences, but we can't be blind, to what I call the sticky structures, right, or the longue durée, as French historians like to call it. And it doesn't mean that there aren't changes or differences, but I think we have to be able to deal with both to have a really fruitful project that is helpful for us to understand who we are historically, and maybe also the limitations to what we can do in the future.
I just want to add something about Latvian Culture Canon Portal. What we did and what we invested by the National Library of Latvia was to translate these canon items or objects into English and German. And the thing what we did not translate it directly. We actually asked people to develop specific texts in these languages, because it was very clear that translation would simply not fly. Anybody reading directly translated text from Latvian into English would simply not get the point about Jāņi or any other thing. So you have to, in a way, conceptualize, and it's a beautiful exercise to think of yourself from a different perspective of other languages and other cultures. And similarly also, when you do that, you do see how you can also upgrade your own description in Latvian language as well by adding either sources or anything. And it is a process of telling the story of specific things. How do you tell it? And I think it was very beneficial for us as well. And I hope actually that also while learning English or German, school children could also use Latvian cultural canon. They don't have to go and learn only about Stonehenge or anything else, but they can also learn about our own cultural values in English or read those short descriptions just for also the sake of learning how to tell the story of us in English.
I really appreciate it. I really expected the Kapusvētki will be the Dead Fest, and it's not. You worked really hard to translate it properly. So any other questions from the public? We have 4.5 minutes left. Anyone? Okay, so then it means that we have to say thank you to people who were ready and who jumped in the last moment too, who are here. And just in few words, Lars, what are these shoes you're wearing?
Well, you know, these shoes have become quite associated with me in Sweden. You know, there was already, 10 years ago, 13 years ago, some journalist, when I was working in a different commission on the future of Sweden under the previous government, and they noticed that I always have these clogs on, right? They're really peasant shoes from the south of Sweden where I grew up. And I think people thought that I was trying to kind of have an image, right? You know, so that it was sort of different or cool. But it turns out when I was working in a cafe in San Francisco, I have a bad back congenitally since I was born. So I had to figure out some shoes that I could use without getting a backache standing for 12 hours making cappuccinos and cafe lattes and espressos. And it turns out I tried lots of shoes. These are the only ones that worked for me. So they are peasant shoes, but in my case, they also have a sort of a slightly medical function, but they become part of my image now in media in Sweden. So it is pretty funny. They are Swedish, yeah, very much so. Yeah, the factory is in the countryside from, you know, where I was, you know, born, basically. So.
Okay, so thank you so much. Any questions? 2 minutes left. Okay, so thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much coming and hiding from rain and being with us. That's actually great. While all these politically passionate discussions are happening on other stage, on duet stage. Thank you, Dagny and Baltiņa, that you jumped in instead of Davis Siemens. That was very, very, we appreciate it very much. And historian and writer Lars Trädgård, who is responsible for Swedish cultural canon. Olga Pracevska, now I have to say, all the way from Tartu, coming to LAMPA. and the best, Krista Buran, coming all the way from Cesis to come on the stage. My name's Lolita Thompson. I'm actually director of the Museum of Janis Lipke Memorial. And just for the last remark, I wanted to tell that Lipke Memorial building, not us as the workers or like, we are a part of the cultural canon. So there are a few new things that are happening, unfortunately, we don't have Davis Siemens who can tell us what high school students have written in this last reflections about the cultural canon. But I really hope that this discussion, and thanks to Swedes who have to organize this discussion about Latvian cultural canon, but it might actually somehow be a great impetus to think more about these things that are half forgotten. Because when I was preparing myself for this discussion, the most information about the cultural canon is happening, 2008, 2009. Last passionate discussions about this canon is 2013. So it's been 10 years. Somehow we've accepted it, that we have it. I know the Latvian National Library teaches it, and you have educational program, for schools about that. But for the rest of us, even for people who work in culture, it somehow hasn't been relevant enough. So hope you'll be back next year with the more Swedish stories. You know, all these sword fights you've done meanwhile. And thank you everyone for coming, and thank you LAMPA, and thank you someone who has to translate all this. Good luck. Thank you.